Alright, let's continue to talk about the eligibility requirements. The third one is paid more than 50% of the household upkeep. This is a weird rule, right? You might think why there is like a 50% rule here. As long as it's like the surviving spouse, is that just qualifying? No, because it's the qualifying surviving spouse. So that's the tricky part about this specific filing requirements. Is because it seems weird, seems pretty strict, and I expand a lot of tax logic. The tax logic explanations can be really hard, but I often said that you should like explain this and understand this and try to get around this like thorny problem, because you need to stand from different angle, and that angle is this like legislative angle. So basically, why you put this law out? What's the fundamental problem this law try to solve? Okay. So basically, the qualifying surviving spouse, this specific thing exists in order to protect the surviving spouse, especially the surviving parent, from the sudden tax increase after one spouse passed away. Because whether it's a widow or widower, you don't want this financial shock after one the spouse passed away, got like no income at that end, and then suddenly the tax still charge you, and if you just file that singly, some of the benefit you won't be able to enjoy. That's kind of financial shock that I want to avoid. So basically, the IRS point of view is that it will give you the widowers like 2 more years of the same benefit that you already enjoy while still married, and just say, hey, everything's still fine, okay, and I'm going to treat you as if nothing had changed before, okay? And then, after you already, go through this really like hardship period, and then I'm going to treat you equally as anyone else, okay? But here's the thing: why they need to verify you paid for more than 50% of household upkeep, okay? So basically, the QSS status is a kind of benefit from the IRS point of view, okay? And if one of the spouse passed away, and they treat you as a one economic unit, and they need to make sure that you are the main person, the surviving spouse, not you, of course. I use that to like indicate to the surviving spouse. Sorry about that. The surviving spouse is the one who still maintains the house and still pays if they got dependents and children. They still pays for the children and still covers for these like core living family expenses. If they paid more than 50%, then they are clearly the main provider. So that means that surviving spouse got hit the most, and I'm going to protect it from the law point of view. Okay? So if you think about this, in real life, it's more complex. So for example, if the surviving spouse, say, still got parents, and parents pay for, say, 90% of the expense, okay? Or maybe they are supporting their very outstanding siblings, or maybe they find new partners, or maybe they claim some government programs that paid most of the upkeep, or maybe some unrelated, but they are like seeing someone, right? And these other adults paid for most of the house upkeep. Things happen, and in this specific scenarios, all the parents, siblings, and new partners, government programs, and or other adults and all that, is kind of like inclusive, as long as the surviving spouse is not the one who paid most of the home upkeep. And the other says, well, even though you are the surviving spouse, but you are not the one who actually keeping the house. Actually, you received benefit from someone else, and someone else is the one who keeping the house. So basically, the surviving spouse is not the person who carried the role of like the deceased spouse and used to play, right? So basically, the qualified QSS, the Q is very, very important. It's not just say, hey, as long as the surviving spouse is then qualified, but it needs to qualify. And this is to qualify. So basically, I need to, take the responsibility, take this, like the pressure, okay? So the QSS is not, for example, if the people who are living with parents, right? So they're living on the same roof, they're living together. So it's pretty hard for you to explain that, you pay most of the bill, because clearly the parents paid most of the bill. So QSS is not made for that, okay? From legislator's point of view. I'm not saying this can't be done. I'm saying this from, legislator's point of view. If you say you're living with parents, it becomes pretty hard to claim QSS, okay? For example, people who say after one spouse passed away and then living with new partners, or from family members, or share equally with someone else, like rent a room together, or there's some people who like they're some of the spouse may not like fully responsible for raising their children, right? It's just to partially support their children. It's not 100%, okay? So basically, there's like sort of a shared responsibility from the family members. So the situation can get really complex. But I just want to know that from the legislature point of view, from the IRS point of view, the QSS is not meant for people who live with parents, who live with new partners, whose expenses like shared like equally with someone else, or who's like only partially supporting their children, not like raising and supporting children of their own as a surviving spouse. So that kind of scenario is not the legislature trying to like cover. And so on the contrary, what does the legislature, when they say they carve out the QSS, what kind of problem they want to solve, what kind of people they want to support? The QSS is meant for those who still, after one spouse passed, still maintain the same house, still supporting the same children, and still carry the same financial responsibility. That this financial responsibility exists before one of the spouse passed away, and still exist and still carry the same responsibility. Okay, that's the specific scenario of qualifying surviving spouse. So in legislature's point of view, basically they assume a concept of continuity. Okay, if it pays, say, more than 50%, in order to like just to keep everything the same, that means one surviving spouse responsibility increased in order to just maintain everything exactly the same. Okay? So that's sort of in order to maintain the continuity of everything exactly the same, but resume more responsibility, more than 15%, because it's like a half and half scenario. You should just previously, if it's like two spouse, and they should like each of it was like 50%. So for example, in that specific scenario, and then in order to keep everything unchanged, one spouse passed away, one spouse have to like take more of the responsibility, pay more than 50%. That's that's simply not fair, because in order to maintain everything else, you have to pay more. Okay, that actually means that surviving spouse, if you pay more than 50%, they increase the payment. that the surviving spouse is truly replacing the deceased spouse financially, like pay more and more and more and more in order to cover that. Okay, so from the legislature point of view. So if one of the spouse, say, pay less than 15%, right? So for example, pay just only like 20% or I don't know, 40% of the cost, then the structure of the home is no longer the same, okay? Because they pay less, then some other outside source must have paid the rest, okay? So basically, there is someone else who resumed the responsibility of more than 15%. That means someone has already taken over as the main provider of the house upkeep. And unfortunately, for example, like parents, like siblings, like new partners and all that, that's still considered someone else has already taken over as the main provider. So you know what? They lose the eligibility. They don't qualify. So you might heard the term of financial head. So in the term of financial head, all this, like 50%, more than 50%, all this legislative point of view, just to make sure that the widow or widower is the true financial head. Then, you know what? IRS will say, hey, that's good. You take most of the responsibility. You are the true financial head in the household. You know what? We'll continue to give you the benefit, the same tax benefit, the same tax advantage that they had when the spouse were married. Okay, they still can have that for 2 years. Okay. If not, so if they are not qualified, then the basis of the filing status, so basically the previous status need to be changed, and the prior married economic unit, right? So basically they treat this like filing jointly as the one economic unit. That economic unit doesn't exist anymore. Okay, as simple as that. So that's the reason is to waive 50%. I want to make sure the widow or widower still is the true financial head.